There we go. Wow. So, we are going to go live today. And to all my friends and family out in Rockport, Texas, we are going to read Just Jellies. Now, Just Jellies, I wrote, is based in Rockport. And so it's based in Rockport, Aransas. And I dedicate this to all my friends, my family, my fans in Rockport. And I'm going to go ahead and read from Just Jellies and see if it's interesting enough to get people interested in buying my books. So, forgive me, I have to take my glasses off because for some reason I can't read up close. So, here we go. This is Just Jellies. I hope you enjoy it. And we're going to start with Chapter 1, Dreading It. As Sarah Dooley and her 2 children drove from Rockport, Texas to the Port Aransas beach, she, in order to save their marriage, couldn't believe the demand Mark had requested from her. He wanted to take the grandkids swimming. Let me turn this down here a bit. And the grandkids, against her insistence, wanted to go too, but only as a family. The last time she had even considered dipping a toe in the Gulf of Mexico was right before the horrific disaster concerning the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, about 41 miles off of Louisiana's coast. She never went back into the water again after April the 20th, 2010. The British Petroleum Company, or BP for short, had one of their rigs explode while drilling in the Macondo prospect. That foreseen disaster had released almost 5 million gallons of crude oil into the Gulf. On top of that, they had also dumped close to 2 million gallons of a dispersant bacteria called Pseudomonas putida. I probably said that wrong. It was designed to eat oil, and they dumped it into the Gulf. That was also the day Sarah gave up her favorite things to eat, seafood. Now we're reading from Just Jellies. Since this thing lived on petroleum, the always professing their right environmentalist believed that the bacteria would not just go away after all the oil was consumed. She persisted that it would just move on to all the plastic waste people, companies, cities, and many countries continue to dump into the sea. Just like men and some critics, the things never go away if you're fixed on feeding them. As Miss Dooley was lost in her world of finding that perfect excuse for not getting back into the water, Spencer, their youngest, began to violently kick the back of her driver's seat. Their grandmother had accidentally drifted into oncoming traffic, and the oncoming semi-truck's front bumper was just within a few hundred feet of playing chicken with theirs. That was a close one, was their Nana's haggard reaction after everyone snapped their necks back into their proper places from her jerking the car and the family into its designated lane. While the kids did their damnedest to proclaim their shock, disbelief, and horror, Bev sank back into the world of that next ocean soup ingredient man's dumb ass decisions had added to the mix. That following year, just 38 days short of a full earthly rotation, Japan was hit by a mega earthquake, March the 11th, 2011. That following day, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant exploded. Her consuming aquaphobia didn't start until the article about radiation being found in the waters off of Japan's coastlines hit the press. That was in August of 2013. After that, Sarah became totally afraid of water. and no matter where the liquid came from, it would never be safe enough for her and the Dooley family. From that day on, baby wipes were for bathing, and patchouli oil was used to cover up any mist and unwanted smells. Being a self-proclaimed tree hugger, Sarah loved having that natural scent of nature wherever they went. The oil smell and Addison's screams were also the reason she snapped back into reality just as the car was about to go off of the road's left shoulder. Between Aransas Pass and Port A is the Port Aransas Causeway. It's about a 12-minute drive from Aransas until you reach the Port Aransas ferries. The 5-minute boat ride takes beachgoers across the Corpus Christi Ship Channel to the best place on the Texas coast to chill out, meet some friends, and maybe have a beer or two. Sarah couldn't tell you the number of times she skipped school and ended up running into a classmate or two out here doing the exact same thing she was doing on Mustang Island, getting the fuck out of Dodge, pardon the language. Or at least the prison called Rockport-Fulton High. Go Pirates! Port A was also where she and her future husband first met. That 3-day weekend with Mark would end up going down as one for the record books. Their introduction started out with the party king handing her his favorite beer, Budweiser. That first hard-to-swallow swig from the lukewarm long neck bottle was quickly and unexpectedly followed up by a shotgun kiss of marijuana and Mark's hard probing tongue. That I dare you to do or you have to touch show went on for the next 4 hours. If Sarah's preachy dad had seen their paganistic display, he would have drowned their sins in the Gulf before shipping her ass off to a boarding school and his to a sex change specialist because good old dad had kept his word. I swear to God, promise. If I ever catch you with a boy, I will rip his dick off and shove it down his GD throat. Goddamn throat. There might be kids watching. Sorry. Get it? Got it? Good. Since her mother's unexpected death, and now that he's the only disciplinary adult, the preacher had become consumed with her salvation. He was willing to do whatever it took to force her demonic adolescence out, even if it killed her. Just as Sarah was about to do to herself and the kids in the car's back seat. The 8-mile stretch of road they were currently driving on leaves the Texas mainland and crosses several bridges as it runs in a southeasterly direction through Stedman Island and Harbor Island. The highway to locals is known as Port Aransas Causeway or Cemetery Road for this part of the route. And that's where she almost ran them off and into the sand traps that will bring any car to a dead stop if those tires just happen to slip off of the solid pavement. We're reading from Just Jellies, folks. Since there were many side roads to choose from when going fishing, camping, or whatever natives and strangers tend to do, just out of view from those passing by, Addison and Spencer's grandma needed a breather before making her mind up over what was being ultimately asked of her. Maybe taking a water view moment would help to calm her shot nerves. But the grandkids' constant badgering about getting in the water now wasn't doing her any favors. As the no and why battle raged, her thoughts slipped back to the summer of 2019. Predictions indicated that the Gulf of Mexico will retain the dubious distinction of having the second largest low-oxygen dead zone on Earth. The Baltic Sea remains firmly in first place. By the end of the summer, the hypoxic region of the seafloor at the mouth of the Mississippi River is expected to occupy over 22,000 square kilometers, the exact same size as the state of Massachusetts. Companies and corporations were doing everything within their power to destroy the last remaining vestiges of life on the planet's surface and its bountiful seas. Except these days, the fish and everything else in the sea were dying, and something entirely unseen was starting to replace them. the oceans were experiencing an explosion of jellyfish and squid. Can you imagine, she thought, going to a seafood market and asking for their latest catch and hearing, "Same as the day before, ma'am, just jellies." As the thoughts started to form of what one might taste like, and trying to imagine how someone would cook such a thing, from somewhere down the island barrier's beachfront, a scream resounded off of its surrounding waters. A family, about the length of 6 blocks away, was pulling a young man out of the water's edge. They seemed to be saying something about a jellyfish sting, and this being unlike anything they have ever seen. Probably a man-of-war, Sarah perceived. Most first-timers, usually those from the landlocked center of the United States, have no clue what kind of dangers lurk in the intercoastal canal and its waterways between the coastline and the barrier islands that do their best to protect the inlands from our hurricane storm surge. More than one tourist has either been bitten on land or in the water during their summer vacation. Many of these small islands that are sprinkled throughout the area have a decent, if not large, rattlesnake population. Copperheads, coral snakes, scorpions, and tarantulas, and the occasional crocodile can be found in these remote nesting areas. And then there's the water. This reality was another excuse Miss Dooley, when arguing with her husband, was quick to give when it came to not getting into the water. Besides the occasional riptide, there were crabs with claws large enough to clip off a toe. If you were lucky enough to dodge them, a stingray. If you were not making sure to shuffle your feet, would more than likely jab its spiked tail deep into your foot or leg. People have died because it went there instead of here. You could also lose a limb due to the infection that tends to come with a nasty puncture wound. But the biggest shock to a tourist is when you tell them that it was probably a shark which just rubbed up against their leg. Those people also go batshit crazy when you finally convince them that not only was it a possibility, but which possibility it could have been. If you're lucky, it was only a sand shark. If you were unlucky, the brush could have come from a black tip, bull shark, bonnet head, lemon head, or the two of the bigger daddies who run the block. Great whites have been spotted along the coastline at rare times, but it was more likely that it could have been a hammerhead too. Their horrifying look always puts a smile on Mark's face. He just had that sadistic quality of finding humor in the fear of others. That's probably one of the main reasons she fell in love with him. He could always make her smile. It was when Sarah saw herself smiling in her side door mirror that the realization of where she had pulled off finally hit her. This was the exact same area where she had lost her virginity to the strapping young pothead, who swore that he would spend the rest of his life with her if she did. And he, to this day, had kept that promise. The current days and continuation of their marriage after this all depended on Sarah conquering her fear of the water. They had run out of liquor and pot that night, and this is where the couple had pulled off before heading back to Rockport. Mark had a few connections he could go to, and a quick run back to his hunting grounds should provide them the party favors needed to get the entire crew through the weekend. But he needed something from his new girlfriend before they did. And she needed something from him too. A reason to piss off her preachy dad. As Sarah sat there satisfyingly reliving his pissed off reaction after telling the Baptist preacher that his demon-possessed daughter was moving out and going to live with her future husband, the town's known pothead, Addison began to frantically beat on the driver's door. Spencer had stuck his foot into the water and something had stung him. Really bad, she began to tearfully cry. Sarah was truly amazed at how close they had become to each other after their parents' death. Before her son and daughter-in-law passed, The two kids couldn't even tolerate being in the same room with each other for more than 5 minutes. And that's only because someone was looking. If not forced to deal and play with each other, you would never see them by or near their siblings. The unexpected tragedy changed everything. The parenting pair had gone on a motorbike tour of the South Texas missions. The 3-day ride ended at the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, where an all-out drinking bash followed back at the campsite. According to witnesses, the severely inebriated couple decided to head back Sunday morning so they could catch the sunrise over Copano Bay, but they never made it. As they were driving out of the Aransas Wildlife Refuge's southern edge, just north of Holiday Beach, 2 javelinas ran out of the scrub brush and made contact with their bikes. It was a hog for a hog. They never stood a chance. You see, the couple were old school riders, and against his mother's wishes, Sarah's son and his wife refused to wear their safety helmets. According to the Texas Highway Patrol, from the point of impact, the couple were thrown approximately 50 feet before their bodies head first hit the pavement. Emergency responders pronounced them dead on their arrival. These kids were now the only reason Sarah was able to keep her shit together. Wave. All right. Just Jellies, we're reading from, dedicated to those in Rockport, Texas. Chapter 2. Do you remember? Before Phil and Dottie left for their adventure, he had promised his mother, Pinky swore in fact, that they would not drink and drive. Sarah had been doing her damnedest to enforce that fact deep into his brain the day after she joined MAD. But like all mothers against drunk drivers, that demand just went in one ear and out the other with her son. Because of their loss, the distraught mother felt as she had been thrust into an unwanted drama. The day of their demise was also what she referred to as her own personal horror movie of screams. And screams she did that horrific day, and the next day, and the next. As Miss Dooley sat trapped in the remembrance of hearing her reaction to being told that her only child had been killed, she never heard her grandchildren's screams until Addison opened her driver's side door and began to physically beat on her grandmother's left arm. Spencer had been attacked by something in the water and couldn't walk from the beach back to the car because of how bad his big toe had been stung. The boy was it. And the boy was it after Sarah got out of her car and went to see what all of the drama was about. The big toe on her grandson's right foot was red and a little swollen. From the looks of it, he had received far worse after stumbling. Let's back up, sorry. From the looks of it, she had received far worse after stubbing her pinky toe on the bed frame corner after groggily getting up to go and take a piss at 3 in the morning. After kneeling down for a closer look, Spencer's southern grandma did what all adults from the South do. She kissed him on the cheek, stood him back up, and told him to get his ass in the car before she gives him something to cry about. All of this came after she harshly reminded the grandkids that they were not supposed to get in the water. So, it's your own damn fault that you got hurt. Now do as you're told. Get in the fucking car. Now. As the kids ran back to the antique, their caregiver stood at the water's edge and decided to take one final look at her nemesis before following suit and heading towards the ferries that lead to the shipping channel they needed to cross. About 10 feet from where she was standing, the native South Texas noticed a very large shadow moving under the water. It was maybe 10 feet wide and close to 20 feet in length. Usually, that meant a decent-sized school of either piggy perch or mullet. And the mullet were the winning team when she saw one, then a few more jump out of the water. Before heading back to their fully restored 57 Chevy Bel Air convertible, because that was her and Mark's dream car, the aquaphobian decided to take that first step to overcoming her fears. Sarah Dooley dipped her foot into the water after making sure there were no jellies, crabs, or sharks, and decided to shake it all around. She was just starting to relax and enjoy the experience when that dumbass shadow of fish decided to turn around after hearing the splashing. And that's when the fun ended, especially after she saw what looked like a small plastic bag, which turned out to be a jelly. But the people anchored about 100 feet from the shoreline were just beginning. Excuse me. Just off the beach was a Nicholson 32. They were made by Camper and Nicholson Helmatic. Sarah loved those long-keeled cruisers, and so did her preachy dad. Just so he could take his family on vacation, there were many summers where a fly-by-night preacher would show up out of the blue to cover for Preacher John. The first time he pulled this stunt, the congregation went into a total state of shock. The meltdown didn't start until he announced that they would be gone for the entire summer. Sarah can still remember the look on the second hand of God's face. The stand-in appeared to have shit himself after realizing that he had just been shit upon. It was priceless and one of her childhood's fondest memories. Taking one final look before heading back to the classic rock and roll hot rod, Sarah watched the family of four grab each other's hand and loudly heard them scream, "Now walk the plank," as they jumped into the water together, something she was so hoping to do with her own family. As those daydreams of happiness washed over her mind, thoughts, heart, and soul, she never heard the family's screams until she blindly opened the antique car's door and looked towards their distressing situation. That's when she noticed something oddly strange about the water surrounding the 30-foot boat. The shadow she had seen before had grown to 3 times its size. The school of fish had been attracted to the family's fun and games and probably thought it might be something to eat. Other than a nibble or two, they shouldn't have anything to worry about. Well, unless the fish all seem to scatter at once, that is. Then they might be looking at a bigger sized school of fish, a shark, hopefully not a bull, or dolphins. Probably just dolphins, she thought, as the all-star grandmother, who she will be after facing her fears today, backed up that black cherry goddess of an automobile before proceeding to pull back onto the causeway. As she and the kids waved their goodbyes because she saw the swimmers waving in the rearview mirror, the Rockport-Fulton alumni from the class of 1987 noticed that the traffic looked as if it had come to a stop. Looked as if it had come to a stop about a mile ahead of them. Being the weekend, she had expected for the ferries to be backed up since summer was in full force too. They could now be stuck in traffic, depending on how many of the car shufflers were in service, for hours. The longest wait in line she has ever experienced was when they had tried to go at midnight, right before the dawn of Memorial Day, and found themselves stuck in traffic for almost 6 hours. It seemed that every South Texan had the same idea. The natives wanted to get the best spots before the invading tourists showed up. And we usually did, she proudly recollected to herself. If she had actually looked back before pulling away from the Barrier Islands beach, the grandmother would have been horrified to see what was left of the slaughtered family. The bloodied mother and daughter had been able to get back onto the boat. The father and son had not. As the almost stripped of their flesh women reached overboard, grasping onto the young man's arms, and began to lift the remaining kid from his dad's outstretched arms, their screams echoed off the water's surface like the lightning's boom does when it explodes from a warm South Texas thunderstorm. It was loud, came out of nowhere, and seemed to go on forever. Just as the dad lifted his son out of the boiling water, his entire body sank into a raging inferno of shadowy culprits. He seemed to entirely dissolve as the shocked women watched. It couldn't have taken but a few seconds, 10 at the most. Their combined screams sounded like that first shockwave you hear when lightning first strikes. The booming screams came when they realized that so was a part of the one they had tried to save. He was half gone. Just as Sarah was hoping to do, get gone, after realizing that they had maybe moved half a mile in the full hour that just passed. At this rate, they could easily be looking at another hour, possibly two. But she did make a promise, and her marriage meant everything to her. She lost everything dear to her after that weekend she and Mark first met, and the thought of losing everything now, especially after her son's heart-aching loss, was inconceivable to her. As the elders sat there trying to recollect their first night together, Sarah was shocked to realize that she doesn't remember much of that drive back to Rockport after losing her virginity a few minutes earlier. She was also flabbergasted when she couldn't recollect that part of their drive from Rockport to the Causeway's turnoff in downtown Aransas Pass earlier this morning. Both drives were nothing more than a blur. Sadly, what happened once they got back that night wasn't. When it came to underage drug and alcohol consumption, you had your friends, dealers, and the shrimpers who could all be found in Rockport's beach after dark. If a parent wanted to know what their kid was doing, or where that doing was taking place, all they had to do was take a drive down the almost 3-mile, that's round trip, make out and party zone. That night, however, all access to the Make It or Break It Club was closed. Reading from Just Jellies, just to show you again, based in Rockport. And to Sarah's heartbreak, along with the entire town, they soon learned why the beach was closed. The most popular and extreme loved kid in school had been murdered. 2 young teenage girls were being hassled by a creep who wouldn't take no for an answer. The star athlete stood up for them and physically, going against an older adult, had to run the guy off. To everyone's shock and horror, the defeated came back and took the life of that wonderful young man. Unbeknownst to them, he took more than that. The assailant took a piece from everyone's heart that attended high school with him. We were all devastated. She still wonders to this day why they never dedicated and renamed the beach after him. Was there even anything on the beach in remembrance of him? Miss Dooley wasn't sure, but if it's not already, she's going to make sure that there was going to be something done to honor him. The star athlete was near and dear to all of them, and visitors, native alike, should know it. The shocked classmate doesn't remember much of her weekend after that. What she does recollect was that they lived like it was going to be their last night on earth, and no experience was off the table after that decision. Princess's Let's Party Like It Was 1999 was their resounding soundtrack for the remainder of that year. Mark and his new girlfriend went on a drug-induced alcohol bender which lasted past sunset that following day. Sarah can still feel the overwhelming touch from God as she laid in Mark's arms while tripping on acid and watching Sunday's sunrise from their hiding spot along the Intercoastal Canal. The vibrations from a tugboat's horn still resounded within her soul. She deduced that this was exactly how it feels when you finally understand just how much God loves you. The acid had allowed her to touch the spirit realm, where she realized that the Almighty didn't give a damn about her mistakes and failures. All it asked from Sarah was for her to love unconditionally and respect those around her. He, and only He, is the one true judge, and He finds her worthy to love, no matter what anyone else or her dad says or thinks. God had sent the Baptist preacher's daughter free from her religious chains that morning. Her decision about what to do next after coming down from her trip and talking with Mark was an unexpected easy one. He had asked her to marry him, and she said yes. Going to get her stuff and relaying that message to her dad later that evening was not going to be a piece of cake. they had so been hoping for. The Sunday temple was made up of 3 rectangular buildings. The kitchen with its fellowship hall nursery were separated entirely from the other 2. Services were held in the middle building, and even though the evening's festivities were still in full swing, her father had posted someone in the church's left wing, just in case his demon-possessed daughter tried to sneak back in for something. That's where her fear of water first started. After the church elder reported back to her dad that she was trying to move her things out, preachy dad surprised his little sinner on her second trip back. The entire congregation, already aware of the situation, began praying and singing for her soul once the ruckus started. They busted out into unadulterated tongues and shivers at the 2-person family's appearance in the sanctuary's side hallway door. As Granny Goodall rolled and slithered across the floor, Sarah's dad dragged her ass across the pulpit stage and was headed straight for the baptismal that had been set up in anticipation of her arrival. They had unanimously decided to call Satan out by drowning the demon out of her. And that's exactly what the holy preacher man proceeded to do. He was tired of her insubordinate ways and decided that it was just best to drown the bitch. While all of this was taking place, about 10 church elders with their own bodies had decided to physically block Mark's access through the hallway. They were doing everything within their power to stop the young man from rescuing the harlot they were trying to save. She needed God. And come hell or high water, they were going to make sure they met, one way or the other. As the all-knowing prophet worked on drowning the plague that had been a thorn in his side, Mark became the Samson to his Delilah. His fist and the skulls he cracked against the walls shook that hallway. His screams and those he beat down to step over destroyed the community's religious pillars. Not one elder, member of the flock, or visiting supporter stood in his way as Sarah's savior proceeded to rip the attacker off of his soon-to-be wife. By the time Mark was through with his quest, the preacher's almost lifeless body lay drowning in the church's tub, right next to his own daughters. Since there were others here, Mark could only save one, and Sarah was his first and only choice. While the congregation focused on their shepherd, the night and wet cloths began the life-saving measure needed to save his most beloved. The lip lock she placed on him because of those heroic actions sealed a bond that to this day no one has been able to break. Something else was sealed that day too. Just as her father's faculties kicked back in, he heard his daughter profess her undying love to Mark. He and the congregation also heard his, pardon my language, get the fuck out of my house response after she proclaimed Mark her Savior and God. Sarah would have loved spending the rest of her day in that precious memory, but the guy honking his horn because her car wasn't moving brought the grandmother's attention back into full focus. There had to be at least 6 car lengths of open space between her and the one in front of them, and since they were at full stop, she would have, if the kids were not in the car, flipped the bastard off for startling the shit out of her before hitting the gas. Instead, she just mumbled what a dumb fuck to herself, or at least she thought she had, until Spencer started laughing because Grandma said a very dirty word. While using the driver's side mirror to give a dirty look of disgust towards the guy who had honked at them, Sarah noticed the flashing lights of an ambulance turning into the same area where they had just had their family excursion. Whatever was going on had to be pretty serious, because she could hear the Flight for Life helicopter blades over the cassette tape of classical rock that was blasting from the car's interior speakers. The mother had been able to call 911 and the Coast Guard before going into shock after watching her daughter do exactly that, going into shock before she fell overboard. There, they never found the body's misfortune would be one of that evening's top stories. Reading from Just Jellies, everybody. Thank you for watching. It looks like maybe one's watching, even though it looks like a few are, but we'll see. Anyway, we're going to read chapter 3 now. Looking back. As the children's grandmother rolled the convertible top back, taking full advantage of their stopped situation, she couldn't help but to take a deep breath from the Gulf sea salt essence that was finally starting to reach them. The memories from that night of getting almost drowned and those afterwards still haunted her dreams and nightmares. Her father, after refusing to call the paramedics and provide the medical attention the congregation believed his daughter needed, tried once more to baptize the demon out of his disobedient kid. But before he could, and with Mark standing in his way, the congregation demanded the preacher to step down and submit his resignation. And after allowing Sarah to recover and quietly gather her things, the Baptist flock packed up the preacher's personal belongings and escorted him and his ship off of their holy premises. He lost his job, his house, and his family that day. Up until the very second of her dad's death, the son of a bitch blamed his possessed daughter for everything he lost. And because Sarah refused to accept the blame, he refused to ever reconcile with her. Need a drink. Give me a second. It was still hard to believe that almost 8 years have passed since hell reached out and took the alcoholic preacher. His will to live pretty much died after the church shut him out. The alcoholism peaked after their doors were permanently locked in the year 2000. He had always hoped to regain his stature, but their closing seemed to coincide with him deciding to go full throttle with a new set of spiritual doors instead, the temple of liquored spirits. The only vestiges left to haunt her after that, to this very day, were those 3 damned buildings. She could only concede that God must have a purpose for them, because they had survived after Hurricane Harvey blew down the doors on August the 25th, 2017. Damn you, God, was her final response before making peace with them and him. God, that is. Her dad and those unholy structures can just stay damned. It took Mark 2 weeks of patience, prompting, and pleading before he was able to get her to take a shower with soap and running water. He actually thought that her fear of water had been cured after that, but like all unexpected things, nature always finds a way to F you over. There we go. And F them over it did. Her fear of water deepened after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, but somehow they sort of got past it. Then came the earthquake in Japan, which led to the Pacific Ocean's radiation poisoning. The quake created a tsunami that caused a meltdown at the TEPCO nuclear power plant in Fukushima, Japan. 3 nuclear reactors melted down, and what happened next in the world's history was the largest release of radiation into the ocean's waters. After reading that 300 tons of radiation every single day continue to leak into the Pacific, Sarah refused to ever drink, bathe, or use water again. Mark was so hoping she would come to change her mind after drilling their own little water well. Sadly, that move never solved the dilemma he had hoped to improve after her irrational decision. She still refused to bathe with it or drink it. Sarah did concede on some things after Mark put his foot down. He guaranteed that cooking and washing with the well water should be okay, because there would be no radioactive contamination, and boiling the water would most likely destroy any bacteria that may be in it. And that short victory lasted only 2 years. In 2019, the dead zone had been declared off of Louisiana's coastline. Scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, had predicted that year's dead zone would be the second largest on record since 1985. Approximately 1,829 square miles, roughly the size of Massachusetts, would be affected. That year's record-setting size was due to the unusual high amounts of spring rainfall, which biblically flooded many parts of the Midwest. Many were expecting to see Noah's Ark float by because of the extreme downpours. Most of the poisonous nitrates were coming from major farming states in the Mississippi River Valley, including Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Louisiana. This deadly runoff from fertilizers, soil erosion, animal waste, sewage, petroleum, gas, and oil had nowhere else to go but down the Mississippi and into the Gulf of Mexico. The deadly hypoxic mix was starving the area of oxygen and pretty much killing everything that wasn't able to escape in time. But it wasn't until local newscasters began to show the pictures of people getting eaten by the flesh-eating bacteria called necrotizing fasciitis. Mouthful. That Sarah 100% refused to ever use water again. When she heard that people who only walked near the water's edge were also contracting it and dying, that final nail came down on the necessity of water's dead coffin. Her mind was unquestionably made up after learning that. No water for you, no water for him, no water for her, and most definitely no water for me. Sarah Dooley had put her foot down. Unless he and the kids were at work, school, or over at a friend's house, water was never allowed to touch their lips or bodies while in her presence. Bath time consisted of baby wipes, and when they were thirsty, only juice fruits and vegetables were permitted to be consumed. Mark and the kids were never so happy as they were when they could get out of the house by themselves and actually drink that clear, thirst-quenching giver of life. The kids' opinions of their grandmother seemed to change after that, but Sarah didn't care. Her mind was made up, and there was nothing he, them, or they could say or do about it. Water was, is, and will always be bad. Mark became a full-fledged son of a bitch after her refusal to back down on that matter, kind of like the SOB behind them. Since Saucy, that was Mark's nickname for her after their last water fight, was once again lost in her daydreams, the backed-up traffic had finally begun to move at a steady and decent pace. The son of a bitch who had honked at her earlier decided that the only way to get Grandma's attention was to go full bore on the car's horn while cussing and flipping her off too. And after turning around and returning the favor in an over-the-top bitch mode, Miss Dooley, while listening to the kids' uncontrollable laughter, proceeded to gather her wits, straighten her wig, and proceed towards the ferry gates, as all of those ahead of her had already done. Except for those western travelers headed towards Aransas Pass, there wasn't a car to be seen on that last quarter mile. They must have started up a few extra tugs because their drive was no longer a stop, wait, then go excursion. But Sarah really wished they hadn't. She was not ready to step into the warm waters of the Gulf and go for a swim just yet. After all the cars had been loaded and secured, the Dooley clan climbed out of the fully restored and very souped-up hot rod and proceeded to join other families who were watching the dolphins while standing at the boat's side wall barriers. The safety measure was around 4 foot tall, and what tourists did with their young children always made our hearts skip a full beat or two. The dumb shits, for a better view, would set them on its painted smooth and perfectly rounded ledge. Even on a smooth day, the tug still rocked a good 5 to 10 degrees when they passed through the other boat's wakes. There were 4 ferry ramps on each side. On a busy day, your car tug, just to get to the other side, might have to drive through at least 6 different wakes. Imagine the size of that tilt. The waves created from a cargo ship could easily cause the ferry to tip from port to bow a good 10 to 15 degrees. A seesaw that not only goes up and down, but one that can go from side to side at the exact same time. What are they thinking? One of these days, a kid and the parent who dove in after them were most likely going to die. She was sure of it. While the Texas native envisioned a child fighting for their lives in the Corpus Christi ship channel, the main highway for monster seagoing tankers, the splashing and cries from the seagulls off the boat's right port caught her attention. There was something unusual about their display upon the water's surface. They appeared to be either drowning or something big was trying to feed on them. Since seagulls don't just up and drown, there was no way that could be the cause of their sinking. It had to be something else. Scanning the ship channel, Saucy quickly realized that all the dolphins were gone. For play, these magnificent creatures always follow and chase the boats. That was the main attraction for why people got out of their cars, to see the dolphins. But there weren't any to be seen. They were all gone. And because she couldn't find any other fins whatsoever, Sarah could only deduce that the sharks were gone too. So, why are the gulls acting so weird? While searching her memory databanks, looking for any plausible reason to stay out of the water, the ship's captain began to sound the arrival horn. People at that point took it as the warning to get back into their cars. That was right about the same time a slight sigh of relief settled over Miss Saucy. She saw a few of the gulls' heads pop back above the waterline. It must be, she thought to herself, the extreme currents running through the channel that was causing them to sink, bob, and dive. But she couldn't ponder that deduction any longer because the son of a bitch captain was laying on the horn and the deckhand was yelling at Grandma to get back in her car. Now. As Miss Dooley returned to her eye-catching ride, she took one last look at the channel while climbing into the driver's seat. Not only were all the gulls in the water now gone, every creature seemed to be missing too. The airways were totally void of those ship bombers also. From what she could tell before driving up the exit ramp, there was no life to be seen upon the water's surface. Nothing. Nothing at all. So, for those that are still watching, we are reading from Just Jellies. It's a short story about Rockport, Texas, and Port Aransas. It's a horror story, mystery, suspense. So, we are going to now start on Chapter 4, A Leap of Faith. As the car's back tires left the wooden planked ramp, that last jolting bump made the housewife ponder whether Mark, by the day's end, would be lovingly referring to her as the light of his life or Miss Saucy. That outcome all depended on the choice she would have to ultimately make here in just a few minutes. They would either stay together as a fully functioning and water-using family, or Mark would be moving out, taking the grandkids with him, and filing for a divorce first thing tomorrow morning. It was all up to her. Thankfully, she and the kids still had a ways to drive before Mark demanded her final decision. When you get off the boats in Port Aransas, you have two main decisions to make. Pay for the right to park on a public beach or drive to where it's free. As you drive east on West Cotter Avenue, you arrive at a stoplight where it intersects North Allister Street or 361 to locals. If you continue to go straight just a few miles up the road, you will enter the beach where the pay for parking begins. That's also where the North Jetties start. The world's shipping tankers begin their entrance into the port of Corpus Christi from there. It is a sight to behold when one passes just a few hundred feet from you. She is always impressed by their massive size. It's even a miracle that something that big can actually stay afloat, the grandmother often said. The rocks and poorly poured cement make a great ankle-breaking pier to fish from, too. The man-made barrier keeps the beach sand from filling in the channel and juts out into the Gulf almost 500 feet, Sarah thought. It's also a haven for sharks, especially hammerheads. Two good reasons, paid parking and man-eaters, not to go swimming there. They were going to make a right onto 361 and head about 4 miles out of town. The family would then take the last entrance road, Gulf Beach Access Road 1, and make another right along the Sandy Beach's front road. That area should have been far enough out of town to be considered free parking, but it wasn't. They still had another 2 miles ahead of them. Port Aransas officials had become greedy after having no choice but to revamp their policing response to spring break riots taking place on their beach. On March the 21st, 1988, one thing led to another and a massive fight broke out. Hundreds of young people rioted on the beach before police, using tear gas, brought them under control earlier that day. Meanwhile, a car that sped off a nearby ferry dock was pulled out of the ocean with 2 bodies inside. By the time it was over, at least 4 people were stabbed, 8 people were arrested, 2 law officers were injured, and 1 person remained hospitalized from the melee along the beach that day. After that, Gulf Coast residents lost another one of their God-given freedoms. You now had to pay to play. There were also other changes, but the one that pissed us all off were the overnight barriers. 12-inch creosote poles, just to the right of the northbound lane, had been driven into the sand. The distance between each one was close enough that it prevented a full-size car from passing between them. Every mile there was a 2-lane gap that allowed vehicles access to the water surf line. If a riot ever broke out again, the police could seal off that section and do what was needed when they took back control. Most locals stopped spending the holidays there after that. Unbeknownst to us, that's just what they wanted. Tourists buy stupid shit and spend their hard-earned dollars on trinkets, restaurants, and other things the city is trying their damnedest to pass off as one of a kind. When it came to the local yokels, we were poor and spent our money on food and crap at Walmart before we headed out to Port Aransas. Other than the beach, a spot to piss, and a place to take a dump, they had nothing we needed or desired. Since Sarah felt the urge to throw off some sauciness before she had to make up her mind and deal with Mark's ultimatum, the kids were gleefully pleased when Grandma purposely fishtailed the car after turning right onto the beachfront road. She needed to kick up some steam, and the loose sand was the best way to do it. It also provided an unexpected pleasure of getting even with the son of a bitch who had continually honked at them on their way here, just as he was doing now. Thankfully, his Mini Cooper didn't have the horsepower that her American-made beast of a machine had, and even if his did, the foreign car stood no chance in the loosely clumped sand. After punching the engine because the SOB was going to try and intimidate her, those small-ass tires sank right up to their axles. The son of a bitch was dead in the water, and Sarah was happily giving him the bird as she and the kids drove to where the water was blue, the beach was empty, and the parking was free. That realization actually stumped the old broad. By the way traffic was backed up on their way here, she would have thought the beachfront would have been a sea of cars. Thankfully, it wasn't. The only vehicle she passed before parking less than a quarter of a mile away was KIII's News 3 van, its reporter, and one lonely-looking cameraman. That's the main reason she stopped where she did. Grandma was hoping to have their victory documented. The other reason was due to the kids were starting to get hungry, and Restaurant 361 was located just inside the doors of Port Royal, about 1,000 feet or so away. She would make Mark take them there for dinner to make up for what she was about to do. To save their marriage and to stay together as a family, she had decided to face her aquaphobia and go swimming with her husband and their grandkids. Saucy almost had second thoughts as she was inflating their water wings, but she saw her husband's car speeding down the beach towards them. The reconciling grandmother didn't want to bargain, argue, or fight anymore over her view of water. Sarah decided to face her fears and surprise him instead. Just as he was about to pull up, she and the children went ahead and waded on in. She didn't know what to say after what happened next. And neither did Mark after he, to save his family, ran out of the car and into the water. Since Sarah was a mixed tape girl and never used the radio, her husband was absolutely sure she never heard the United Nations emergency broadcast. And because Saucy was probably still pissed at him, she wouldn't answer her cell phone and had probably turned it off when he tried to call and warn her and the kids to not get in the water. He'll have to deal with that issue later. For now, he had a family to rescue. As the deranged grandfather sped past the news crew, their shouts and excessive warning towards his family could only mean one thing. The world's leaders were telling the truth, and 3 of the Dooleys were possibly about to die. The reason for the news crew being at the beach was due to the new species of jellyfish that were depleting the oceans and killing anything and anyone that stepped into their watery domain. The UN had declared a global emergency and were telling everyone to stay out of the sea and all waterways and lakes connected to it. The news crew learned that truth the hard way, or at least the reporter did. Since he was only standing about 3 feet away from the dry beach sand, the on-scene reporter actually believed that he would be safe, and if something happened, able to get out in time. His feet were completely dissolved before he was able to throw himself back onto the dry land. His entrance was just about the same time Grandma and her kids walked into the water too. The aquaphobian was hoping that they would be accidentally filmed and the family could say that they were on the evening news. The camera was facing their way after all. Hearing the shouting and her husband's car horn blaring at them from down the beach, Sarah Dooley changed the way she was hanging onto the kids before spinning around. She grabbed an arm from each of them. They were now swimming behind her and just outside the water conqueror's peripheral view. Well, that's a mouthful. As they began to proclaim Grandma, probably just to get her undivided attention, Mark's car horn and the screaming cameraman came running towards them, quickly drowned out the kids' excessive badgering. It sounded as if he was yelling for them to get out of the water because of the jellies. But they're just jellies, she responded. So long as she didn't spot a man-o'-war's purple bubble floating on top of the water's surface, they were all safe. That was also right about the time her husband's car came to a sinking stop about 30 feet from the Gulf shoreline. He sank that front bumper deep into the sand. He'll probably blame her for that, too. As Saucy turned, telling the grandkids to look at what their grandpa did, her heart instantly sank into the depths of her horrified soul. They were not there. Well, that's not quite true. She was still holding on to their hands, but only from the elbow up. The rest of what should have been them was gone. While she began to frantically scream and search for their bodies, Mark's feet could be heard entering the water as he frantically splashed towards his wife and missing kids. He was maybe 6 feet from his wife when he saw the same discovery she was in the process of making. The floaties were still there, but they were magically dissolving. Something in the water was in the process of consuming a petroleum-based product, and whatever was doing it seemed to also have the ability of devouring flesh too. But Sarah wasn't focusing on that. She was seeing something he was not. The second she saw Addison's fire engine red locks break the surface, the hysterical grandmother violently snatched for them in hopes of saving her drowning granddaughter. But that's all she saved. The last undissolved remains of her sweet Addie. As Miss Dooley did everything she could to not go into shock, the weird-looking jellies she had seen earlier in the day when Spencer got stung fell from under the mass of hair dangling from the grandmother's clenched fist. The only reason it stuck in her head was due to the fact that she thought it was a piece of plastic trash. It sort of reminded her of a sandwich baggie, kind of like the ones that used to come with her pot back in the day. No sooner than it hit the water, so did the mass of thousands that were surrounding her. They hit her hard and they hit her fast. Right at the exact same moment Mark was reaching for his wife. The second his supporting hand started to slide under her outstretched arms, Saucy's body began to disappear into the Gulf's warm waters. As Mr. Dooley stood there holding the only woman he has ever loved, he watched every portion of her that was below the waterline dissipate. She literally dissolved right before his eyes. And that's when, after realizing that he was next, Mark Dooley dropped the rest of her remains into the school of jellyfish that now seemed to be focused on him. The startled swimmer hoped that the remains of his wife would buy him enough time to get out of the water. But the only thing that sacrifice brought the grandfather was 2 steps in the opposite direction. Because he never felt their attack, Saucy's husband thought that he might actually stand a chance at surviving the watery grave that was coming for him. If he had anything to say about it, the sea creatures could just go and F themselves. It wasn't until he collapsed in the Gulf's knee-deep water that he had no other choice but to accept his fate. Every portion of his body that was under the water had been consumed by the jellies. The free-swimming marine colinterrates, gelatinous members of the subphylum Medusosa, ooh, that's a mouthful too, had quickly overtaken their prey. Even his hands and arms that he used to cushion his watery fall were gone before he ever stood a chance of propping himself above the waterline. The last thing Mr. Dooley saw was the News 3 cameraman recording his death as the clear jellyfish swam over the sinking face of their next meal. The final words he heard were those screaming from the shocked cameraman, "They're just jellies. They're just jellies. They're just jellies." Just jellies, folks. So I hope you all are enjoying this. I'm fixing to read the last chapter. And, they're for sale. And here we go. Last chapter of Just Jellies. Chapter 5. And now the news. Just after the world's top leaders declared a global disaster, warning their citizens to not go into the water, Corpus Christi's KIII News Channel 3 sent a small crew over to Port Aransas. They wanted to see for themselves just what all the fuss was about. And due to the unusual emergency, the reporter, like most of us, thought it was nothing more than a joke. We were all wrong. Due to climate change, warmer seas, and poisonous pollutants, the jellyfish population had begun to explode into a plague of devouring colinterrates. God, I know I'm saying that wrong. Those in political charge urged all lovers of the sea to stay out of the oceans and any open waterways that may be connected. The jellies seem to be unaffected by the difference between fresh and salt water. If the swarm is large enough, they also seem to have an ability to consume someone faster than a starving pack of piranhas. Stay out of the water. And if our warnings are not a deterrent to do as we recommend, then watch this footage that was shot by our cameraman Dave while he was in Port Aransas today. Due to the graphic content, we highly suggest that if there are any children who may be in the room, please make them leave now. The Dooley family's demise were the first victims to be video recorded as the unknown and never before seen species of jellies set upon them. As the local population of South Texas sat watching the footage in stunned silence, so did most of the planet. Their story and video footage had gone viral. As John Dexter, KIII's main news reporter, was removing his shoes and socks, we could hear the cameraman Dave in the background voicing his concerns about the man going into the water. John was arguing with him and telling Dave that it was probably just another hype story, and he was only going to go in just a few feet into the surf line anyway. No more than ankle deep. What's the worst that could happen? And within a few moments, the entire world saw exactly what could happen. Just as Dave started to roll, we all sat in horror as the news reporter seemed to stumble before doing his damnedest to fling his body back onto dry land. His feet were gone. When he first started to speak, viewers saw what looked like a patch of clear plastic floating around him, and in the blink of an eye, the bottom 8 inches of his legs and feet seemed to instantly dissolve. When asked later, the reporter said he never felt a thing. It wasn't until his body began to drop those extra unexpected inches into the water that he instantaneously realized something was seriously wrong. That quick thinking absolutely saved his life. Just as John's torso slammed onto the dry sand, we all watched him point down the beach and scream at Dave to go and warn the family to get the F out of the water. They tried bleeping the word out, but everyone watching pretty much said the same thing when it happened. Fuck. As Dave, yelling at the family to get out, took off screaming down the shoreline with the camera still on his shoulder and recording everything that was happening, a boat of a Cadillac could be seen headed straight for the woman and her 2 children. The news station's cameraman had covered about half the distance when the car came to a slamming stop, sending its front bumper deep into the sand. We could all hear Dave yelling at the woman, telling her to get out because the jellyfish were dangerous. Those watching were stunned by her response. They're just jellies. And that was when the unthinkable happened. The heads of the 2 children seemed to snap into a state of shock before quickly sinking under the water. And just as the man started to run into the Gulf to save them, the woman turned around to only find out that she was holding their last remaining vestiges. Addison's right arm from the elbow out was in her left hand, while Spencer's left arm was in her right. Everything else pertaining to the children was gone. From the audience's point of view, there was nothing left until the screaming woman lifted a clump of red hair from the sea. That's when the world seemed to scream with her. And as those screams continued to shake the globe, as we all watched the unknown man grab for her, before he realized that from her waist down, the bottom half of the woman was gone now too. There were no words or screams left to describe the final few seconds of the video before it was shut off. What was left of the victim and her rescuer seemed to liquidly dissolve into the sea, and just like that they were gone. And so was the world's love for the sea. As the local news anchors did their best to regain some form of composure, they left all of South Texas with a few final warnings. Stay out of the rivers, stay out of the lakes, and most of all, stay out of the water. And that is Just Jellies, read by the Greenman. I can put my glasses back on now because I only need them for long distance reading and seeing, not up close. I hope you enjoyed Just Jellies. It is available from Breaking Rules Publishing. 20% off, folks. 20% off. Use the code Time to Read. You can also get it at Amazon. And look for my next release, Real Skin. You're going to enjoy this one. This one's creepy and disgusting. Just how I like it. Anyway, have a good day. Be safe, everyone. Take your best when you go out. If you got to run errands, don't take your family. Don't take the kids. Just do what you got to do and get back home. And in time, we'll all be thankful when this passes. So be blessed and love y'all all. Bye.